Good evening, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland, and I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. And in case if you're not listening to this in the evening, hello. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. With me are my shipmates for Star Trek, Dana Nicholas, and Nori Ely. And yes, it has been a super hard week at work. Long days. But we're here to talk about Picard. And I just got to say, this season's hitting all the feels for all the great parts of TNG, TOS, Voyager, Deep Space Nine. All the things I love about Trek are in this season. Dana, how are you doing with Love and Picard?
I love Picard. I love the show. I love that all of the characters, my favorite characters, are coming back. I wish they'd come back sooner. The only person that I do not love on the show, once again, is Shaw. Just saying. I don't think I'm going to be a convert.
Well, I really like Shaw. I like all of it. So I'll go ahead and be the Shaw fan here.
No, I'm definitely a Shaw fan. And it's not just because I also like Malbec. He's good. So, and he's had a nice character arc, and I appreciate him being dynamic. But we get to see all of the heroes from TNG come together slowly but steadily as this season has progressed. And we're going to cover 3 episodes in this podcast: The Bounty, Dominion, and Surrender, which sounds like a perfume from France. So, if not French foreign policy. So let's talk about The Bounty. I absolutely love this because it was fan service done right that moved the story along by going to the Fleet Museum and just getting to have starships that we've seen. It was, I agree, seeing the Enterprise A was very moving. But we also got to see the Defiant, we got to see Voyager, we got to see Kronos 1, that was the Chancellor's flagship in Undiscovered Country. There's a Romulan warbird over there, and I think the Stargazer 1 is in there as well, or at least the same class of ship. We also see the New Jersey, which is a Constitution class ship, pre-refit. So again, it's just a love letter to starship nerds and getting to see spaceships, which again, who doesn't love that? But having a decommissioned military vessel on display makes for some fun things to think about with museum ships, because there are museum ships that we have in the United States that could be put back into service if the Navy needed them. Now, that would mean some very bad things have happened. So we have 4 Iowa-class battleships. The Iowa, the obvious one. The Missouri, that's in Pearl Harbor. Iowa's in San Pedro, California. You have the New Jersey in New Jersey. And you have the USS Wisconsin in Norfolk, Virginia. Of those 4 battleships, theoretically, all could be put back into service, but the one that's the easiest to put into service would be the Wisconsin, because it's preserved all the way through. So you can only tour the deck. The entire ship is sealed. So I've been on board to tour the deck, and knowing that there's all these treasures down below, in the event Marines ever need 16-inch guns to do shore bombardment. On the other 3, you can go tour them. Scouts can spend the night on the Iowa. So there's, like they do educational programs now. But God forbid we ever need a battleship again that to be able to shell a country while we do an invasion. So Wisconsin would be the easiest to put back into service. In theory, the Midway in San Diego could be put back in service if needed, but there's a lot of tourist attractions that would need to be removed in order to do so. So theoretically, the same thing could apply to those ships in the museum fleet, that they could be put back into service depending on how decommissioned they are. Like if warp cores have been removed, like if they've, like the one example would be with some warships, we'll take out the propellers off. So they can't go anywhere, even if they could. On the flip side, some still have them. So in the event that you need a propeller for a battleship, it's still there. So, but I think the example, the Pampanito submarine in San Francisco took the propellers off. So you can't go take the submarine for a joyride. So anyway, I just nerded out about that. But we get into the issue of borrowing a cloaking device from the Bounty that was used in the voyage home to go save the whales. Who would like to take the issue of trespassing in order to go steal a cloaking device?
Well, so I was thinking we would get to the trespassing when we get to the part where they are on Days from Station. So maybe we can bookmark that one, because that's a much more poignant example.
So this will get compounded in, just because, yeah, there's a trespassing factor here.
But you're totally right in the sense that we could run this analysis here. We'll fold that back in. Remind me, Josh, to compare with going on to this museum station for this purpose. So remind me to do that.
Notice I went straight to the ships. So
yes.
Yeah, see where my mind goes.
You're a ship guy at heart.
Yeah, I like boats and airplanes and spaceships. It's just, I'm really easy to shop for. So I love my Enterprise. So
I'm really easy to shop for too. I love diamonds and other things. What I didn't love, however, was on Vadoc's ship at the very start of the episode, we see that her underling shoots a coworker because they're trying to figure out, we got to go catch Picard, we got to get Jack Crusher. We can't let this happen. And he's like, well, we only have like a couple days left, and we don't know where they are, and we're all really tired. And they're like, psh, and disintegrate him. So, I mean, does that create a hostile work environment for him? Absolutely. And does it create a hostile work environment for everyone else? And I would argue that it does. So watching your coworker be vaporized, yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem. Nari's like, oh my gosh, I know she didn't just go there. But it could be also argued that if you are a marauder working for changelings, maybe it's an assumption of the risk. You're out there creating felonious conduct. And so maybe it's part of the felony murder rule. Like, you're out committing crime.
The felony murder rule.
Oh yeah, I know. You're out committing crime. What happens to you happens to you.
I think that's a great analogy. I do think there's also potentially, like, when you started talking about this, my mind started running through, and how would someone get a remedy for this? So I think you also run into the problem of contracts against public interest, where you're going to get thrown out of court if you try to show up in court and argue that you were entitled to more pay or better working conditions for work on a marauding, murdering vessel. I was owed more for my murder.
But they may have thought that they were acting in the right, because, after all, Starfleet invaded their homeland and gave them a virus that, really harmed and killed quite a few of them. So
during a war, so it's not.
So it's a war crime.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Josh, I don't know that we ever podcasted about this, because it was the events of Deep Space Nine, which is, I think, before at least I started podcasting. But oh boy, that's a genocide.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that one. Nuclear weapons aren't by themselves a war crime. So
all right, here we go. If we're going to talk about this, I have thoughts. I'm going to give it some quick thoughts. So the topic of nuclear weapons, so like, I think there is, like, if we're talking about the Dominion War and the Federation's use of a biological weapon that arguably was attempted genocide, that is definitely outside of the law of war. It's against international law. We now have treaties regarding genocide. It is a complicated topic. And the best argument that I have for why it was justified, I will not say there's like there's a big asterisk here where it technically meets, I think, the definitions of certain violations of the law of war, and I don't think you can seriously argue that it didn't. However, I think the most serious arguments on the other side are that it was justified because the opponents, the Japanese, and on whom the atomic bombs were used in World War II, were arguably not following the law of war, but not just not following, because that happens quite a bit, but not even playing lip service to following it. We're not acknowledging it as a thing. And you had all kinds of horrible atrocities committed by the Japanese military on occupied civilians, on POWs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in a situation where I think you are facing perhaps an enemy who is not paying even lip service and not acknowledging the law of war that you are trying to follow. And this was not really the case with World War II, but it is something to think about when we're talking about these science fiction examples. And if you are facing perhaps an existential threat where it is not sort of the traditional way that we conceive of war, of one nation maybe dominating another, but instead we're talking about one people exterminating another, those would be the circumstances in which I think you are most strongly justified. I don't know for sure if you in fact are, but that's the strongest argument for when you might get a pass for violating the law of war. I don't think that was the case with the Dominion War for a couple of reasons. And feel free to give me some examples, Josh, of the opposite. But as I think the changelings in this show point out, the Dominion was executing a traditional war against the Federation. They were trying to occupy territory. Their ultimate goal was to dominate politically, or in a sovereign term, but not to exterminate the peoples that lived in the Alpha Quadrant. You'll have to remind me, Josh, if they were following the laws of war, but it appeared to me that they, if I remember, and I haven't researched Deep Space Nine to prepare for this, but I think they largely were.
So the Dominion used something called the blight on a population that refused to surrender to them. That was a biological weapon that killed them. So they would, and it was generational. So they had lesions on their faces and had a quickening death type scenario. So they
specifically in the war against the Federation is what I'm looking for, though, because if we're going into have you historically violated the law of war, that's another analysis, and I don't know that it's the most appropriate analysis, but I think, Josh, we can research that. That sounds like a blog post.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think it's for the society that's supposed to be about justice and freedom. Opening up with a virus weapon early into the campaign is problematic, but they were concerned with getting overrun. And when you get to Sisko in the pale moonlight, he's willing to make some very big trade-offs with his own morality in order to get the Romulans into the war so they don't lose the war.
I totally get that. In the law of war, though, we think we're losing is not a pass.
Yeah, but history is written by the victors. So if you're going to be...
The law of war is a collection of traditions and norms, and it is not automatically rewritten by the victor.
And I think that one of the things that makes that so egregious is that, if we look at the atomic bomb that we dropped, we weren't exterminating all Japanese everywhere. Yeah. But in this instance, the Great Link, they're all connected, right? So it's not like we're not just targeting enemy combatants, we're targeting all of them. And that's
I think that is absolutely correct. That it is also, I'm using the A-bombs on Japan as the closest real world analogy that we have, but this one is way worse.
It's way worse. And then I will invoke the Trump of all Trump cards. I will invoke Michelle Obama. When they go low, we go high.
Yeah. There is a biological example from World War II, and that was the planned Japanese attack with poisoned fleas on San Diego that was supposed to launch in September 1945. So their plan
was it poisoned fleas that would exterminate all Americans?
Exterminate San Diego.
Yes, biological warfare is also something that violates the law of war, independent of the idea that we're going to be attempting genocide, and or, as Dana pointed out, also targeting an attack that has essentially, by its nature, it will not discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, which is another like cornerstone of the law of war. Which is another complicated analysis. Like, it depends on whether there's a military target and how proportional that is to the civilian damage. But in this case, this is like a law school hypothetical, because it's all the changelings. There's not a real analysis to perform on that side.
No, but it also gets into the following episode of Vadic was tortured at Daystrom to be turned into a wonder weapon. So they, again, all kinds of crimes taking place here that you don't experiment on POWs. The Japanese did in China using microwave weapons. And the logbooks that were recovered, they don't say they tested the weapon on a person. They say monkey. And that was how they referred to anyone of Chinese descent that was a victim of their weaponry. So yeah, there are ugly examples to get into with world history. And I mean, Picard's done a good job of like touching on those. I mean, it's the Twilight Zone effect that Rod Serling couldn't talk about racial discrimination because people in the South wouldn't watch it and the networks wouldn't carry it. It was, I'll talk about a robot instead to get the point across. And we're finding ways to continue telling those stories using pop culture. But
sorry, that was a long aside about something that was referenced but technically didn't happen in this episode.
So let's talk about breaking into Daystrom. Walk us through it, Nari.
Absolutely. Okay, so it will surprise no one that it is a crime to trespass on a government facility or installation. Yeah, if that's a surprise to anyone, I'm sorry, you have a lot of reading to do. The specific statute is 18 USC section 1382, entering military, naval, or Coast Guard property. And there are two paragraphs to this. The first one is the one that is most relevant to us. Whoever within the jurisdiction of the United States being our typical stand-in for Starfleet or the Federation, goes upon any military, naval, or Coast Guard reservation, post, fort, arsenal, yard, station, or installation for any purpose prohibited by law or lawful regulation, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 6 months or both. So it's important to note that first of all, our heroes here are in fact gaining entry for an unlawful purpose, which we'll cover in just a second, which is stealing government property. But for the curious out there, and this is a great opportunity, Josh, for our usual disclaimer that nothing on this podcast should be construed as legal advice. But it should be noted that in general, although it says in this statute that it doesn't prohibit all entry, prohibits unauthorized entry for unlawful purpose, that unlawful purpose is automatically satisfied if the government premises, military premises in question do not permit entry to the public. So this is the thing I wanted you to remind me about, Josh, which is the museum station. It seems to me that the museum station does permit entry to the public. So in that circumstance, had our heroes simply entered that station, they would not automatically be subject to that extra step. They would have to also have entered for an unlawful purpose. Of course, they entered for the unlawful purpose in that circumstance of stealing a cloaking device from one of the ships, which is going to, again, get us back into stealing government property. I'll get into that in just a second. So either way, in both the circumstance of Daystrom Station, in which it is not open to the public, so it's an automatic violation, and they're going on to commit another crime, and in the circumstance with the museum ship, where it is open to the public, but they're going on to commit crime, they are running afoul of this statute. So should I just dovetail right into the stealing government property?
Go.
So It will also surprise no one that it is a crime to steal government property. So in this case, the cloaking device in the museum ship, I think we can agree, whether or not it was originally the property of the Klingons, is now in a ship that is possessed by Starfleet and is sitting in a museum. So it would be government property, and that would be 18 USC 641, public money, property, or records. Whoever embezzles, steals, purloins, or knowingly converts to his use or the use of another, or without authority, sells, conveys, or disposes of any record, voucher, money, or thing of value, nice and broad, or of any department of the United States, or of any department or agency thereof, or any property made or being made under contract for the United States, or any property or agency thereof. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. Shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 1 year or both. So in this circumstance, I think once again, our heroes, while they may be morally justified in what they are doing, are running afoul of this statute, both on Daystrom Station and at the museum. So at the museum, they are of course stealing a thing of great value, which is a cloaking device on a Klingon warship. In the case of Daystrom Station, they're arguably not stealing a thing, although they end up stealing the security system. But they went in to steal a record. But that is, of course, something that is also covered by this statute. So in both circumstances, I think they are violating 18 USC section 641.
But I would argue that data is a person. The data lore kind of thing is a person. So can you really steal a person?
Yeah, I mean, Dana, I'm going to agree. I think they're liberating him. But
he's locked in a trap. But someone who wasn't there of his own accord, it was actually the body of Picard. So the body of Picard is at Daystrom Station. And I would argue that Vadic and all of her evil henchmen, that they have committed grave robbing. And under the New York Penal Code 145.26, aggravated cemetery desecration in the second degree is a Class E felony. And that happens if you dig up a coffin, open a crypt, or do anything to disturb human remains. And that could include similar vessels containing human body parts or human remains, which have been otherwise interned, buried, or stored. So I think that's a clear violation of that law when they happen to take Picard's piece of his brain. So
absolutely.
Yeah, it's desecration of a corpse. It's not okay. Let's not forget that the body of James T. Kirk is also in Daystrom Station.
Yeah, what are you doing with all the bodies of people?
Yeah, with a biobed sound going. So the showrunner has stated that the last episode will have a post-credit scene. I bet dollars to donuts it's like Kirk, like his biobed opening or something. So as a tease, but I've been wrong before. But you don't just throw out the body of one of the greatest captains ever and leave that Chekhov gun unfired. So, but again, I've been wrong before, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get some Kirk action.
I'm going to fall out of my chair if that happens.
Yeah, it's just, again, it would be wonderful fan service. So, wow, Nara, you covered a lot. Just to go with the HMS Bounty, okay, that was a Klingon ship commanded by Krug, faced off against the Enterprise. Enterprise is destroyed in order to be a fighting chance for life, and the crew of Enterprise commandeers the Bird of Prey, the other warship. I think that's justified and legal. And the example that I have from it is U-505. When during World War II, it's the only time that we had a ship go out right before D-Day, so they didn't make a lot of noise about it. And our Navy captured a German U-boat. And they sent a boarding party over, after forcing it up to the surface, captured that bad boy, captured the crew, and the leader of the boarding party was able to stop the German scuttling device from going off and sinking the boat. And thus, there are cool pictures with the U-boat with flying the U.S. flag, and that's now in the Museum of Science and Technology in Chicago. And it is super cool to go see it with how they got it there after sometime, I think in the 60s.
I was going to ask, how did they get it to Chicago?
The river, so it's the Great Lakes. So the U-505 was used as a training sub by the Navy for a bunch of years, renamed Nemo. And I've gone on 2 tours over 2 different time periods. So the first tour was like cut out and you walk through and there's the docent that talks you through it. The second version, years later, they rebuilt the sub pen. So like this thing is sitting, it's like they got it through the lakes and then through downtown Chicago and then built the building around it. And it's like a 4D experience going through the submarine, because when they turn off the lights and you get the depth charge experience, it is way scary and way dark. So it's like being in a cave. So yeah, depth charging, not fun, but we did commandeer a German U-boat, and boy howdy, that is kind of like American gumshoe right there, and goes to a privateer nature as well. So I think it was totally right for them to take that Klingon bird of prey and then go once again save the Earth. Which also means like the cloaking device used by Kirk, Spock, and Scotty, like Scotty touched that. Now LaForge touches it too and uses it. I just think that's really neat that once again it's being helping save the day. But let's talk about data lore Sung Lal being used as a security system.
Data lore Sung Lal before.
I'm sorry, I missed one.
Yeah, this is a can of worms. So my first thought on this was, so it's an interesting question. So as to whether or not data is essentially being forced to work here. So and a threshold question, I think, which is at least somewhat interesting, is whether or not this is like the security system here is actually data, or I'm using data for short here, this amalgamation of these consciousnesses. Because he seems to be, obviously not in full possession of his own body, but does appear to be at least somewhat conscious of what's happening, which is why once the security system recognizes Riker et al., the security system starts putting into place security measures that are essentially designed to communicate, to signal to Riker and team things that will remind them of data, because data seems to be trying to communicate with them, and ultimately lets them in, if I remember correctly, in order to find his body. So I'm going to assume here, for purposes of this analysis, that we are in fact talking about data, at least in a semi-conscious state, as opposed to simply something running through his body's circuitry, but not actually data. And in that case, we have some problems because this is essentially involuntary labor for no compensation. And also, I'll get to the second part, not seeming to respect any labor laws. So, but the first and most important one is, of course, that this is arguably a violation of the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment, Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This is a subject that we can get into in a second, as to whether or not Days from Station is a place subject to Federation jurisdiction. I think I would argue that it is. In that case, this appears to be involuntary servitude. I'm not sure, it wasn't really covered if they asked this amalgamation of consciousnesses if they wanted to be employed in this fashion, but it seems unlikely given the practices of the Daystrom Institute. And is it section 31? Is that right on this? Yes, on this facility.
Yeah, it's like, let's leave you standing guard 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year at a location that you don't want to be at. Like that's absolutely not reasonable. And I could see that neither Data, Lore, Soon before, none of them really wanted to be at Daystrom Station. And there's no indication that they wanted to be there. So I concur. I think that this is definitely a violation of the 13th Amendment.
And then, Dana, we also have labor laws. So I think, I mean, it's kind of a moot point because he's not being paid, but I bet they're not paying him overtime.
He's not getting his meal breaks, right? Like,
yes, exactly. In circumstances, at least where there is especially physical labor involved, and usually security guard is something that fits into that category because he's patrolling the base in a sense, and like you said, standing guard in a very literal sense. There are often mandatory amounts of breaks and meal times, sometimes maximum amounts of time that you can work during a certain period. There's also lots of requirements for being able to take certain kinds of leave. I doubt they're allowing him to take personal, medical, or family leave. So it's just, they're essentially ignoring all possible labor laws that could possibly apply. And in addition to violating the 13th Amendment, I think Data could perhaps bring suit for a lot of back pay with liquidated damages.
So one thing that I was curious about was, how long has he been standing guard? Did Soon bring him there after the events of season 1 of Picard? So we might be dealing with just a year or two of being used this way, or has he been there for, since the events of Nemesis with his consciousness? Because before it was at Daystrom Institute, not Daystrom Station, but that didn't mean that a copy of Data's positronic matrix couldn't have been installed 20 years ago. So those are unknowns, and I don't know if we'll ever get an answer to that.
You're absolutely right. And during the episode, Picard actually says, hey, look, I had to lose you once. You told me to let you go, and I don't want to have to lose you again. And so we just don't know.
Yeah, and it raises an interesting issue of personhood. If you're getting copies of yourself made and activated in different places, that are thus then having different experiences. So again, it's a very weird issue with artificial intelligence, and it's suddenly becoming portable and downloadable, as opposed to just being in one positronic matrix, and that's just where we know them, as opposed to getting backed up in different locations.
And I think every lawyer out there wishes that they had a clone at one point, especially during discovery, right? Or trial. You wish that you had a clone to help split the workload. You're like, this would be cake if there are only 12 of me.
Yeah, but you're still getting paid as one person, and then you need to, unless you get reabsorbed in. But
we know that's complicated thanks to the Tuvix episode.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. Now, we do have a note here about Beverly disclosing to Picard of Jack's medical diagnosis.
Yes. So if people go, it was a violation of HIPAA. But what people typically don't understand is that HIPAA actually stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So most people think that it's a privacy act, but really what HIPAA was designed to do was to say when and how you could get information related to your medical records, and that you could move your insurance from one place to another if you changed jobs or if you moved other places. So that's actually what HIPAA stands for. But in this case, in part of it, what it allows people to do is to have privacy and say which third parties can have access to their medical information. And I would say that Beverly telling Picard that Jack has a terminal illness and showing him the actual scans is a violation of his rights, unless Jack has said, yes, you can tell my dad about my medical condition, because Jack is of the age of majority, so he's not a minor. It's not as though Picard actually needs to know that information. And so Jack would then have a cause of action under California law for invasion of privacy. And then so the publication of private facts, maybe not so much, because under Gates versus Discovery Communications, Inc., the court, which was overruled on other grounds, said that with reckless disregard for the fact that a reasonable person would find the invasion of privacy highly offensive. So you have to have the distribution of the information and someone else would find it highly offensive. I think telling other people, hey, look, I have this incurable mental illness that affects my hold on reality, people might find that to be highly offensive.
Yeah, but there's a difference with going, Dad, who died of the disease, and I know that's a radically complicated statement. Like you had it, you survived it. That's different than the issue of it being disclosed to multiple third parties or published.
So I was going to say, yeah, I think it's not for legal purposes. I don't believe it is different if you're disclosing it to an interested loved one or someone else. But Josh, it is correct that for public disclosure of private facts, it does have to be made. It does have to be a public disclosure. So it must be to the public at large, which would be like if you posted it on the internet, or to so many people that it is essentially the same. So telling lots of different people in ostensibly private communications would probably count. I should hope that this is the only time that Beverly is disclosing this information about her son. So she might be okay on that one element.
Yeah.
And yes, I concur that it would probably not meet the publication requirement, but an episode I have to look back and see how many other people were in the room.
That's a good point. Yeah.
People who were on the ship with her, and on the screen it's flashing terminal disease. That's not always an awesome look. But she does actually invade his privacy because he is over the age of majority and it's his private health information.
Yeah, and I did want to say, so I'm not an expert in it, but there are, just like lawyers have, doctors have additional ethical obligations. So while it's not necessarily like a source of civil liability, I think there's very likely an ethical rule that she is violating here by just sharing with someone who is, his biological father, but he doesn't have a relationship with him, is not his guardian, as you're pointing out, a very private medical fact, which while it may or may not result in a lawsuit that Jack could bring, it may result in her losing her license.
Right. And there's not even an exception for her. So there's an exception for medical professionals to disclose a person's medical information if the person will harm themselves or others if they're an immediate threat. And here he's not an immediate threat. Yes, he has these visions and he sees things, but Picard is not a person in authority who can prevent him from doing that. He's not the acting captain. He's not the captain of the ship. And it doesn't appear that Jack is an immediate danger to anybody. He's in the bar drinking whiskey.
Right. Especially at this point, he is now being medicated. So while we learn later that it's not, in fact, just this syndrome and is not fully managed by this medication, as far as Dr. Crusher knows at this moment in time, he is not a danger to anyone or himself.
Excellent. Great analysis. Well, let's get on to Riker gets captured, and then we see a Starfleet officer just beating that old man senseless.
Josh, this yes.
Well, let's just start here with the legal analysis. No.
So I do want to point out, this is like the most annoying part of this for me is it turns out that of the 3 uniformed Starfleet officers in the room involved in this enhanced interrogation of Riker, 2 of them were regular Starfleet officers and only one was a changeling. And at the point at which the changeling is ready to kidnap Riker, like turns around and shoots the other 2. So there were 2 uniformed Starfleet officers
You didn't say like, whoa.
Yes,
whoa.
exactly.
calm down. What are
The
you
scene
doing?
would have made so much more sense to me if they'd all been changelings, right? Because then they're not that concerned with whether or not they have legal or moral obligations to a person in their custody.
And I thought that in that instance where they had the two regular officers that were just standing around, that was kind of the producer's nod to the George Floyd incident, saying that you're just as liable if you're just standing there.
Yeah, and it being your first day is not an excuse for police brutality. So, and in Riker's case, like, yeah, he's the war hero who saved the galaxy multiple times. He's also 70. So they're just wailing on a 70-year-old man and they're standing by letting a captain get socked around. That's not very Gene Roddenberry track, where theoretically, we have the good guys who go like, we don't do that. What's your problem?
It's kind of par for the course for a lot of criminal procedural dramas in the United States, but it definitely should not be par for the course for Star Trek, and has not been. So to Josh, to start walking through some of the legal analysis here, I'm going to start with some of the complicating factors when it comes to let's assume that this scenario is analogous to Riker being in the custody of law enforcement. That is the if that is the most straightforward scenario. Riker is a citizen of the Federation. He is in the custody of Federation law enforcement officers. It is against the law to physically harm someone in government custody. Do not believe what all the crime procedural dramas tell you. Not only would any confession by Riker here be suppressed under the Fourth Amendment suppression effect, so they may lose whatever criminal case they would have against Riker here. Riker would also have causes of action under constitutional tort for the violation of his rights. So that's under the assumption that, well, maybe what they don't really care about getting a confession from Riker, but they're beating him up because they're trying to get intelligence, right? This is the prototypical, like, what is it, 24 or whatever it's thing where they're beating the person to get, where is the bomb? If you are a Federation citizen, that still cannot happen to you, and you would be able to sue for constitutional tort even if the suppression clause wasn't your remedy. But there are a couple complicating factors here. The first one is, as I said, so if you are a U.S. citizen or a Federation citizen, your rights and protections under the Constitution travel with you. It doesn't matter if a U.S. official detains you in Peru, you still have all of those protections. There's a potential complicating factor here because of changelings. It is possible that the Starfleet officers in the room believed that he was in fact not Commander Riker but was a changeling. In that case, there's still one more thing here which might make the difference. Even if you are sure, let's just assume that they are absolutely sure that he's a changeling and not Riker a Starfleet citizen or Federation citizen, there's still the problem of whether or not this station, because I assume he's still on the station when he's being detained and tortured, is Federation. So Federation jurisdiction, essentially. So it's not made fully clear to me, and I wasn't able to find also by poking around to research where Daystrom's station is located. So there's a few different analogies that we could draw. If this is in fact a Federation station orbiting a Federation planet in Federation space, most likely under the Federation's jurisprudence of jurisdiction, this would be Federation land territory or similar sort of analogy. And this is really critical in law, that even if you are not a U.S. citizen, if you set foot on U.S. soil, virtually all of the rights and privileges and protections of the Constitution and other statutes, with very, very limited exceptions where it specifically says citizen as opposed to person, you get all of those protections and all of those rights, and it's powerful and it's very important. There's a reason why there's a lot of fights over whether or not you should let someone who wants to claim asylum onto US soil, because there really is essentially a magic power with setting foot on US soil. So if this is in fact Federation soil, for lack of a better term, then all of those protections and privileges and rights still apply, even if you think that this is not a Federation citizen that you're dealing with. The other possible analogy here is where this is, let's say, neutral space, or the planet of someone who is not in the Federation and their space, but is nonetheless a Federation facility within that space. There are real world analogies for this with Guantanamo. And this gets unfortunately, very complicated. So the best that I can say right now is that the US courts have generally and repeatedly punted on the question of whether or not most rights attach to a person who is arguably within US control, because Guantanamo is a US controlled facility, but not US soil. At minimum, you do have the right to petition for habeas corpus. That's what the courts have been very comfortable saying, and they've generally kicked the football and everything else. Apparently, as recently as 2 weeks ago, the DC Circuit punted on yet another question about whether or not certain civil rights attach to a person detained at Gitmo since 2004, I think it was. So, really long time. But in any event, in that circumstance, assuming, like I said, we'll just assume that they think that they're sure that Riker is not a Federation citizen, and this is not actually Federation soil, but a place being leased, for example, by the Federation, you do have some issues. However, when it comes to determining whether or not someone is a Federation citizen, that is one of the most important rights or important facts that a person has. So many rights can follow with that. There should be some procedure, some level of procedure to determine whether or not someone who claims to be a Federation citizen is in fact a Federation citizen before you can treat them as though they are not. This is something that has been dealt with on occasion in the courts. For example, when a person is wrongfully deported, even though they were in fact a citizen, and things like that. It is, if I can paraphrase, because I'm sure I'm not quoting correctly, perhaps the most dear of all rights that we have is whether or not we're a citizen, and it should not be taken lightly. So in this case, I know it's really hard now to figure out whether or not someone is a changeling, but we were not shown that there was any process before he is treated as though he is not. The last piece, sorry, this is a long analysis, I know, but the last piece for why this is still probably wrong is even assuming that Riker is a changeling, there are still laws of war that would apply potentially, and policies that would apply. Now, I'm going to start from the policy one, which is that, kind of like how we were talking about before, this is Starfleet. It's supposed to embody the best of our values. It has to be the case that Starfleet has policies against torturing people in Starfleet custody, even if you think they're an enemy combatant, a saboteur, a spy, or what have you. So again, this is like a very serious breach that these two Starfleet officers are committing to what we think are probably Starfleet policies at minimum. The second aspect, though, is a little bit tricky, which is whether or not, assuming that Riker is in fact a changeling, whether or not he would nonetheless be protected under the laws of war. This is a little bit tricky because prisoner of war status attaches to someone, an enemy combatant, who is taken prisoner and who is wearing the uniform appearance of the opposing armed forces in a way that is distinguishable from non-combatants. I think we could write a whole little article just about that with changelings, because they inherently seem to not have a distinguishing uniform appearance by their very nature from changelings who are not combatants. But at any rate, it could be argued that Riker was caught as potentially a spy or saboteur, wearing appearing to wear the uniform of Starfleet, but not wearing the uniform of the opposing armed forces. Again, though, this is predicated on the assumption that this is a changeling and not Riker. And it seems to be an extremely important predicate to perform some level, and probably a very serious level, of process to determine whether or not we are dealing with Riker, Federation citizen and Starfleet officer, or changeling spy who was caught not in uniform. And we don't see any of that, and it's very unfortunate.
So you put a lot of thought into this, and I would add the issue of the right to counsel, that if you're taken into custody, you have the right to counsel. Now, several years ago, when we had the horrible bombing during the Boston Massacre, the individual who was captured in record time, it took them a while to give him his Miranda rights. A federal judge went to the hospital and with a defense attorney in tow and gave the bomber his Miranda rights. Now, the question then turns into, why did they wait that long? And why did a federal judge have to go, I'm a little concerned about this, and go make sure that the suspect got his Miranda rights? And the issue is, you can have an exigent circumstance argument that they were trying to find all the bombs that this individual could have had. The search of his apartment, they wanted to see if it was booby trapped and if there was, again, other explosives. And law enforcement might make the argument that we didn't Mirandaize someone because they wanted to find devices that are a threat, like, again, the loaded gun, in the playground type situation, or a pipe bomb in the playground. And but by doing that, they risk the issue of botching the prosecution because they haven't given the suspect the Miranda rights.
Yeah,
Riker's not given any sort of Miranda rights. They're just punching the old dude. It's again pretty tough for a 70-year-old.
You keep picking on him for being 70 years old. In like 12 years, you're going to be 70, and then you're going to be like, what?
I'll be 60 in 12 years. 22, I'll be 70. So that's hurtful.
I'm projecting.
He's in magnificent shape. He's a zaddy, and we should be proud of that. So, and sing his praises.
But yeah, I was just going to agree with you, Josh. There are a whole host of rights that they're violating here. I was focusing on whether or not they can punch him, since that seems to be the most acute problem. But totally. And I think to your point, I mean, the police technically can keep questioning someone even if they haven't Mirandized them, but that's because the primary remedy in these circumstances is suppression of any evidence that they get. So it is a possibility that a law enforcement agency might decide that it is more important right now to continue to ask this person questions in order to, like I was saying, gather intelligence to find if there are other bombs, if there are other bombers, if there are more attacks, if it's booby trapped, but they risk very seriously losing their case against this particular offender.
So I remember in law school, in criminal procedure, hearing about the Christian burial guilt speech. That was the guy he did something horrible. So a child's either kidnapped and killed or kidnapped and left someplace, and it's Christmas. And so the suspect is captured. And like on the long drive back to the police station, the arresting officers are giving this guilt trip about, making sure that the kid has a good burial because it's Christmas, and like playing a lot of empathy type points. And the guy breaks and says where the kid is. I don't remember all the facts if the child survived or not. But the issue is trying to guilt trip the suspect into confessing after Miranda is problematic. Like you shouldn't be doing that type of trickery. If they've asked for the right to counsel, the questioning ends. Like you don't get to go and with a violin in hand and try to break them that way. By way of comparison, there's like no effort to get Riker to talk. It's just punch until he breaks and says where the Titan is.
Right. And maybe they're trying to determine why he's in there, because Daystrom Station is a pretty confidential spot, and it's already been broken into once before. So they may be fearful of some type of terroristic attack.
Yeah, another, because they've already had the attack on the recruiting center.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. There are limited exceptions to when you can question someone prior to Mirandizing them. I think you're right, Josh. This would probably, under that theory, it would fall into the public safety exception. Still, there's no public safety exception to punching the prisoner, though.
No, that's just no. We're not supposed to do that. Just no. That said, a lot of analysis for Dominion and surrender overlap. And that stems from the fact that Titan is playing possum because they treat the audience with respect, and it's the shuttlecraft that has the cloaking device for Worf and Raffi. And they're playing possum in a debris field left over from the Dominion War. And they trick the Vadic on the Shrike to find the Titan and then to board. And that raises issue of piracy because Shrike isn't a flagged vessel. It's not from a nation state. These are fanatics as far as Picard and company know at this point in time. So piracy is whoever on the high seas commits the crime of piracy as defined by the law of nations and is afterwards brought into or found in the United States shall be imprisoned for life, going around boarding other ships.
I have the definition under the law of nations.
I think I cited it last time or in our Mandalorian episode.
I was going to say this. We've covered piracy quite a bit lately.
But share it.
So this would be under I believe it's the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Article 101, nice and front and center. Piracy consists of any of the following acts, and for purposes of brevity, I'm only going to read the one that is relevant here. Any illegal acts of violence or detention, so this is both violence and detention, or any act of depredation, also likely fits it, although I'm less familiar with that as a legal term, committed for private ends by the crew or the passengers of a private ship or private aircraft, and directed on the high seas against another ship or aircraft, or against persons or property on board such ship or aircraft, against a ship, aircraft, persons, or property in a place outside the jurisdiction of any state. So that's the emphasis that you were putting, Josh, where this is not a flagged vessel. So this is, for international law purposes, a private ship. It's not commissioned or owned by or following the orders of the Changelings. This is a splinter extremist group. And so for legal purposes, this is not a state or public ship or aircraft.
Yes. So again, just boarding, it's a trespass, and there's malfeasance afoot with people getting killed, but that happens a little later after the plan goes sideways, because don't hook up lore to the ship security system. So with Vadic being imprisoned, I think that's a lawful thing to do and to capture her, because she's tried to kill them multiple times. She's stalking Jack. I think that's valid. But when our heroes start talking about, do we just kill her? That's a little uncomfortable, because Picard and Beverly aren't supposed to do that. And it just shows getting pushed to the breaking point. They don't, but they're in a dark place.
Although I was going to say this might be the opportunity to talk about how prisoner of war status attaches to an enemy combatant who's wearing some kind of uniform, basically. Like, I use that word a little loosely. It could be a uniform appearance. It could be clearly displaying an insignia that distinguishes you from non-combatants. And so this is the, like, I think what some people misunderstand about the law of war, and it's what's so dangerous about serving as a spy, for example, because you are not, very clearly not doing so because you're trying to blend in. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not sure, just the way the law of war works is that if a spy is captured by a nation having obviously not worn a uniform and having blended in as a civilian or even a member of the other military, they don't get those protections. And what that usually means is that you're subject to prosecution under the local laws. If they don't have a policy against abusing prisoners who are accused of spying, that could be what you're up against. It just, all of the protections that attach to prisoner of war status do not attach to you. And it's
we've debated this, and there have been Supreme Court cases after 9/11 with the war on terror on what do we do with members of terrorist organizations.
And I should say domestic laws would still apply, but if you're on domestic territory and things like that. But just in terms of, are there added protections by virtue of being a POW under the law of war? And that one is unfortunately probably not working in Vadic's favor here.
Yeah.
Or fortunately, I guess, because we don't like that.
But it highlights with the war on terror that we've had service members give Miranda rights till Al-Qaeda because it's just what we do. And like we were uncomfortable not doing it because we start sounding pretty sinister if we're just capturing, again, terrorists who want to kill US citizens. Like, they're the bad guys, but that doesn't mean that we drop our standards and morality in order to fight them.
Yeah, and I should be clear that, like, the law of war is not the ceiling. It's the floor. And so you can have additional laws and policies that would govern your conduct in these circumstances. It's not the ceiling.
Thank you for mentioning that. So we focusing a little bit more on surrender. So we have the Lord trying to do a hostile takeover of the body that also houses data and the other memories, because apparently the controlling personas are lore and data. The other three are more of an archive, even though we did hear two of them speak, or one, we heard Sung speak. So that hostile takeover raises interesting self-defense type issues with data versus lore and this positronic net. Dana, do you want to take the first stab at this?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I still like, just going back to Dominion for just a second. It's a very interesting concept to me when Jack enters Sydney's mind and directs her body where to go.
Oh, yes.
And so that creates an interesting dichotomy. And across the country, the law on battery is very different. So for instance, in Georgia, a person commits an offensive battery when he or she intentionally causes substantial physical harm or visible bodily harm to another. So it's not enough to just kind of like, hey girl, how you doing? And it calls out that it has to leave swollen lips or other facial body parts, substantial bruises to body parts, or substantially blackened eye. That's very different than California, where it's the unlawful and it's the intentional, non-consensual, and harmful or offensive contact by another person. And I could see that someone entering your mind and controlling your body would be probably disturbing.
I'm going to pile on here because I think this is a really good point. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Are you going to keep?
Absolutely, go right ahead.
I think also this is a really great line of thinking. There's also, we were just talking about invasion of privacy torts. There's in addition to this time where he is busy controlling her bodily movements, we also saw, I think, a preview either in this episode or at the very end of the one before of him reading her thoughts and listening to them. I think you could argue that this fits the intrusion into private affairs tort, which often covers eavesdropping. I think for the original eavesdropping, where he's just like hearing her thoughts and then touches her hand because that's what she wanted him to do, probably not, because you do have to have a harm that was that happened to a plaintiff, and that the eavesdropping or what the wrongful conduct has to have been a substantial factor in causing that harm. But in this case, because she is arguably sustaining physical injury and other batteries as a result of this, you might be able to argue that this fits into intrusion into private affairs. I think the other elements are probably met where it's an intentional intrusion that occurred in a place where a person had a reasonable expectation of privacy. The inside of your own brain and your private thoughts is, we think we have a reasonable expectation of privacy there. And a reasonable person would have found the intrusion highly offensive. I think being puppeted by another human being, most people would find pretty offensive.
And then there's always the exception or the defense to that, right? So he's going to argue, hey, I saved your life, but for me interjecting myself into your brain, you were just standing there doing nothing and you were going to die. Just saying, you were going to die.
Yep.
Now, I thought with the fight that she had where he did the assist, there was an invitation from her when they made eye contact for help. I also wasn't sure with that fight at that point in time, it was the puppeting taking place. If that was more, we see him doing the same movements. So is he in control, or is he like mentoring her on what to do? If it's mentoring, I'm more comfortable with it. If it's getting into the driver's seat, I am super uncomfortable with it. It's really weird.
I do want to point out that also we made eye contact as a evidence of consent if this is disputed, right? And it always there has to be a dispute about the issue. But if it is disputed and that's the evidence, that's going to be a thin reed to put much weight on.
but it's when they make eye contact that she makes a mental request for assistance.
Right. So we don't know if he was reading her thoughts and asked, hey, would you let me in? And she said yes. But...
Right ahead. Please do everything. I want to do what you're doing right now. Exactly at the same time.
Yeah, it's watching that. It's like, what's happening here? How's that working? Because it's, and I kept thinking Patrick Stewart played, Professor X. What are we doing here? So,
well, I am very intrigued.
Gonna do a disco move. Make her do a disco move at the very end.
Yeah, he was clearly flirting with her. I would not. He was doing a lot of wrong things. I would not finish it off with that, just to end up in the creep category forever. There'd be no way out at that point. So, no disco moves. All right. Let's go back.
I guess I should also mention, while we're on the topic of Jack puppeting people, assuming he is in fact controlling people, which I think he did state that
he can do, and got a guy killed.
That's what I was gonna say. There might be some upset decedents there who would want to sue him.
This is where I think the issue gets complicated. Because it's a combat situation and the changelings are just killing Starfleet officers left and right. So the crew of the Titan's being hunted. Was that guy going to stay safe? Or is this a weird trolley hypothetical? Or the fact that did Jack put him into a more dangerous situation by just looking around?
He moved him. He took him from a point of safety. The guy could have been near Jeffrey's tube, hop in the Jeffrey's tube and hide out, right? And
I-
so instead, he walks them past a dangerous zone. He's looking around and not paying attention to his surroundings. And we know from Jack's takeover of Sydney that he's capable of doing physical moves, of defending himself, and he just didn't do that.
Yeah, I think in this circumstance, he was still feeling out the scope of his powers, and so was not acting with full awareness or responsibility, like you're pointing out, Dana. It seemed to me that in this particular circumstance, it is certainly not a foregone conclusion that this poor Starfleet officer would have died in this circumstance, and certainly would have died in that circumstance. He might have been able to defeat this particular combatant had he been in full control of his own body.
Yeah, it's not good. And notice he doesn't explain what just happened. So
No, and doesn't feel sufficiently guilty or traumatized by the experience, in my opinion.
I think he's in the, I don't want to talk about what just happened ever, like ever. I will never share this information. So, and that's guilt. Like that's guilt. So, lore.
Yes.
Lauren, you have a
I'm
very
happy
good-
to talk about this for a
you-
second.
You got a good theory. Take it away.
So, this is a really interesting, science fiction circumstance where there are multiple personas, but we'll simplify our analysis for now to the two that you mentioned, Josh, are not data banked, lore and data, that are sharing a body. And it seems to be there's no, existential threat as they are with the two consciousnesses in the same neural net or positronic matrix in the body. They could both live there together. And yet lore being lore wants to erase data and gain full control of the body. You would think that this is maybe not a circumstance that our present day laws are adequately suited to. I would argue that it might be. So, and that's simply because usually the definitions of homicide are not incredibly specific. They use words like killing, ending the life of an individual, as opposed to something very specific like killing by harm to the body or things like that, that would limit it to what we think of in today's terms of murder, because you normally have to kill a body in order to kill a person. In this circumstance, I think lore's acts do fit within the definition for homicide and murder under existing statutes. So this would be California Penal Code, Chapter 1, Section 187. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being or etc. with malice aforethought. Now, for purposes of this, the human being in the Federation laws, data has been determined to be a person for legal purposes. So assuming that this law has been updated to reflect person instead of human being, I think it would actually fit, which is interesting. It's not what I expected when I first started poking around this issue. Of course, he does not succeed, but nonetheless, it is attempted murder. On the converse side, when data essentially, I think it's arguable that he ends lore's life as lore knows it. Even though there's an aspect of sort of absorbing lore into himself, he does say goodbye to his brother. So I think there is some acknowledgement that he is in some way killing lore. In that circumstance, though, which is why I emphasize that they could have both peacefully cohabited the body, I think Data would have a self-defense because lore was actively engaged in attempting to kill him. Dana, did you have any thoughts? You looked like you were about to talk.
I was like, absolutely. I would agree wholeheartedly that lore was attempting to commit homicide, and Data did have self-defense rights. But how far could he go? Could he just go to immobilize lore? Could he just take over enough control so that he could immobilize him? Or did he have to actually end his personality? Because the defense that you have is limited to what you need. You can't overstep. You have to move to a place of safety. And so I think that Data probably overstepped there.
I don't agree. I think lore's actions were a clear, constant threat to eradicate Data. And, even at the end, it was for complete control, complete domination. And Laura was thinking he was erasing Data, while Data was showing his true poker face and being able to bluff his way to a victory that did not actively require taking a life, because his ethical programming prevent him from doing so. So he found a way to survive that also comports with his ethical programming to not kill anyone, and valid under self-defense laws.
I have three things. I'm going to try to not forget them. The first is that I'm gonna disagree with Josh and agree with Dana that when it comes to the self-defense to murder or assault, facing what you perceive to be or may really be a continuing threat is typically is not what we look at. In those circumstances, you have to go to the government and appeal to law enforcement to put an end to the threat. Of course, we understand that is not maybe practical in this circumstance, but that is nonetheless not a valid defense for self-defense, that you think that there is no end to this unless this person is incapacitated or ended.
That's
but
not what I meant.
But I am also going to acknowledge that in this circumstance, and this is probably where the law is very poorly suited to this circumstance, among many other reasons, that Data may not have had any other means at his disposal. And so, in such a circumstance where there's just the button to kill or not kill, and by not pressing the kill button, you will die, that might be a very narrow exception to that.
And that brings up a good point that supports Josh's position, in that there's, in a lot of jurisdictions, there's no duty to retreat. Right. So once someone has presented themselves and you feel at fear for your life or safety, or the serious life or safety of others, there's no duty to retreat. And so,
and also in support of Josh, arguably, I was going to say, arguably, there's even no ability to retreat within your own body.
Right. If it's your own body, where you're going to go?
even if he had a duty to retreat. And then the last bit that I was just going to say is what. Again, another topic that existing law is very, very poorly suited to address, because we have yet to envision facing such a circumstance, is what Josh pointed out, that very arguably what Data is doing is not in fact killing or homicide. But since apparently, as Josh pointed out, his ethical programming prevents him from doing so, he is absorbing lore, and lore continues to exist, but as part of a combined entity, with Data's personality as sort of the predominant personality. We obviously don't have anything like to deal with that in our law.
And this reminds me of a 1970s kind of chic horror film, where there was a two-headed man, and so there was an African-American male, and someone grafted another person's head on his body, and then he wanted to kill him and take over the whole body.
Because he was racist. Let's not forget that part.
Yes. So that was very interesting. So it's like what's old is new again.
Yeah, need to go look up the name of that film, but yeah, my friends on Monster Party have discussed it multiple times, and there's a cat. So
Jack says hi.
There are notes about the removal of dead bodies. Is that who?
I think we kind of already covered that in our previous section.
Yeah. So one thing that I had mixed feelings about is when they retake the ship and Raffi's killing changelings with blade weapons, which I didn't know would work. Worf is then disposing of the bodies with a phaser, and that, I don't know how to feel about that. I mean, it's tactically the right thing to do because you don't want them getting back up, causing problems again, but it's either making the rubble bounce, it might be desecration of a corpse, or it's just the double tap to the head to make sure it doesn't get back up again. And I have super mixed feelings about whether that was legally right, even if it was the tactically sound thing to do.
Well, I do agree that it was the tactically sound thing to do, because they know that the changelings have developed and changed so much so that they can pass a blood test, right? So you can cut them and they will bleed. But we just don't know what other functions they might have. They might fall down and then get back up. So I think that it was definitely the tactically sound thing to do. In that case, since they're going in to rescue someone, I think that they're okay. I mean, it's a terrible thing to do, but I don't think that it's illegal to rescue someone from an enemy, terrorists who are holding them captive.
Oh, it's the rescue is absolutely fine. I'm way on board with Worf and Raffi, taking out the bad guys left and right. It's the cleanup crew that I had mixed feelings about on whether or not that's okay. And which brings us to the, again, the classic Picard plan to blast the bad guys out the airlock. And we get to hear Seven say, "Get off my bridge," in a very Air Force One type of way. And Vadic's reply for something I won't say. But again, classic.
I'll say it.
Oh, get off my bridge.
Get off my bridge.
So good. So good.
Terrible humans.
Yes.
Terrible solids.
You're a bad man. And then she gets sucked out into space and shatters, and we get to see, Shaw take back command with stations, and like they don't. We're now in the zone of you're gonna find out what you just unleashed, and they dispose of the Shrike, and I hope they picked up Picard's corpse, because it'd be weird if they had left it and then they blowed it up. That would. I'm like, would you tell him? Yeah, we found your body, we left it there, and then we blew it up. You're still gonna have weird feelings like maybe I wanted my former body to have a good burial. Like this is, again, it's a weird thing.
It's just
That's
kind of
so weird.
Yeah,
it's so weird. And then with her floating into space and breaking into a gazillion pieces, didn't they kind of do that in DS9 and they reformed back together?
yeah, but
I
you
think-
would.
Am I wrong?
Yeah, I think they can survive in the vacuum of space as long as eventually they are recovered.
Yeah, so I think she could be recovered, but I don't know what the modification, if the vacuum of space would kill them, if swords can kill them now. So that sounds, because they're like organic looking as opposed to gooey looking. Again, they're different. So again, maybe we see her rise again, but that's a lot of Vadic shards to go find.
I know. I was really hoping that instead of breaking apart into pieces, she would head like right into that deflector thing and just get incinerated. But oh well.
Then we know she's gone. I mean, this would take, with the way just space works, and so they shattered. All the pieces are going different directions forever and ever and ever. So collecting everything, passage of time, all those shards are going different places.
I find it fascinating and said that there could be like 4,000 different Vadics.
Ooh, that could be. She does cut off her hand and then the other thingy appears.
Yeah, but then the hand retaches.
Right, but
So
like
that's why her
are
body parts
changelings?
could reattach in space.
Yeah, but also I'm wondering if changelings can be like starfish.
Yeah, Odo couldn't. So, but can the new breed that way? How do they reproduce? I don't know. Regardless, it was very satisfying to see them solve the Vadic problem. And we end with a nice conference room table where they're all discussing what they need to do.
And I did want to note that I did find the development of Vadic's character also very interesting, that while I think it's safe to say that none of us agree or endorse her actions, it makes Vadic a much more sympathetic character to have had this horrible crime committed upon them and their friends and family. That it seems almost inevitable that a person subjected to that would want to return violence.
And then she's not even accepted by her own people. They treat her differently because she's now slightly different.
But she did have legal remedies against the Federation. And so trying to wage a genocidal war is probably not the right way to handle that.
I
But-
was going to say legal remedies, except for the part where she escaped, because I
Yeah.
don't know that she had the ability to petition anybody from a test tube file.
Yeah, that is hard, but once she had escaped, escape laws are familiar with those from Luke Cage, that if you escape, you still have to make an effort to turn yourself into non-corrupt law enforcement in order for the wrongs to be righted. But that would be like, again, this is extrapolating, but like if you escape the corrupt state prison, going to the feds and saying like they're violating my civil rights, this would be, I was at this Section 31 black site, which would be like the equivalent of waterboarding and other bad things, that being able to say my rights have been violated. She conducted experiments on me. No, like this violates your own laws. I'm not your guinea pig. But that would require finding counsel.
Yeah, I have to say it is not there's been a series of things we've discussed today that were not the finest hour for the Federation, and the degree to which the Federation and Starfleet, often related to Section 31, seem to be willing to compromise or ignore their own principles, if not laws, can be very troubling.
Yeah,
And it just goes to show the historic pendulum, right? So we have a group or an agency that goes from one extreme, and then they swing over towards making things right all the way to another extreme, and then they start to head back. And I think that that's where Starfleet is headed. They go from their violent past to heading back to another violent future, because they think that they're justified.
yeah, and
There's no such thing as a completely bad person or a completely good person. But I just was, it ruined it for me, because I was hopeful that in the future, in Star Trek land, people just were better.
I guess I'm not too bothered by that, in the sense that it is always hard to stick to your principles. And the only time that principles actually matter is when it's really hard. So, I'm kind of okay with the idea that it is a essential human failing that we, even in the distant future, will sometimes, at least, although hopefully less often, fail to stick by our principles. But I agree, it's still a little bit sad.
Because it's always the right time to do the right thing.
yeah, there's part of the challenge when a free society goes to war and they make adjustments in order to win the war, that you then go back, and you learn from the mistakes. So you don't, you learn from World War I, because after World War II, you don't want to have a World War III. So you learn from the first mistakes that caused a Second World War, so you don't repeat that. Martial law ended in Hawaii much too late in the game after Pearl Harbor. So it took a while for, despite the fact courts were back, for martial law to ratchet down, and it took a court case for that to happen. Those are the challenges when, like after a terrorist attack, our blood pressure's high, and we enact measures to protect people, And it's like, okay, I'm fine taking off my shoes at the airport because the comparative harm of what's more inconvenient, my shoes coming off or dying screaming from a bomb on an airplane. I'm okay taking my shoes off. However, there are other things that we need to look at and go like, are we really comfortable staying this way? And those are the things that warrant discussion. You know, the fact that we just recently, you know, knocked out the, you know, authorization to use force from, you know, 9/11. You know, it's like that was 20 years ago. So we were justifying military operations on something from 20 years ago. And those are the things that we have to think about of if we need to use force, we need a force bill in order for us to, you know, wage combat. That means we have to make that decision and Congress has to vote on it as opposed to just punting to go, well, we got this thing from, you know, 2001, we're just going to use that. So those are the hard questions for a free society that has to fight to defend itself. So is Star Trek in this part of the Federation, are they still ramped up post-Dominion War, post-Borg invasion, that they're still in a high stress, mixed situation with like, what is the right balance now?
Well, I'm going to start by taking issue with what I think was the most profound statement you made, Josh, which was, I actually don't think that anything we do at the airport is anything more than security theater. But besides that, I will say that, you know, we talk a lot about this topic, but it is worth noting that you know, the Federation used a biological weapon, arguably attempted genocide against the changelings in the Dominion War, and you know, in order to avoid being conquered by the Dominion, in order to avoid being subject to their laws and their norms. But if you are essentially, I mean, you talked about how the Dominion used a biological weapon on an entire planet. If you are essentially adopting the means of your and the values of your adversary in order to defeat them, you know, what are you actually fighting over?
Nothing worth living in. So yeah, not good.
Not good.
Yeah, just not good. So
I know it's late and it's overtime, so I will let that be my last thought
well, this will be your last battlefield. So
for tonight. There will be many more.
Oh my goodness, I feel another theater coming on. It's going to be great.
yes. So again, 2 more episodes left and a post-credit scene. Go watch the box right now because it's a very solid episode. So with that, everyone, wherever you are, thank you for tuning in. We covered 3 episodes. It's been a lot. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay geeky. Take care now.